Hey, everybody, and welcome to the show. This is Liz joining you as usual from Central Virginia and the unceded lands of the Monacan Nation. And I am so glad that you are here with me today. And if you are new to exploration of the sacred feminine, or even if you're not new and you're just wanting to go a little bit deeper, I would encourage you to check out my award-winning book, Home to Her, Walking the Transformative Path of the Sacred Feminine. It's available wherever you get your books. There are also so many past podcast episodes that you can jump into. There's a back catalog of 5 years at this point with just some truly incredible guests. So I definitely encourage you to look back if you're relatively new here and just see who you might want to listen to. There's a lot of variety. Um, I also am just wanting to name that if you haven't already, if you listened to the episode called The Future of Home to Her, that's episode 102, I think, just explains that you might hear a little bit of a shift in the podcast in these later episodes. And that is really reflecting sort of my own evolution with this work and understanding where it's going and not where it's going, but I guess more where I'm going and how I'm relating to it. And one of the things that I say in that episode, and I've tried to really articulate in other places too, is this understanding that everything we know about power has been defined by and taught to us by cultural structures and institutions that were created without any input or even participation from women. And I mean every single one of them, all of them. And so my path into this work was really through the portal of the sacred, but the longer I journey with it, I can see how, of course, that influences every single aspect of our lives. And if we look at systems that were built even to support us, if we recognize that they were built without our input or our participation of women, they really can only take us so far. It's not that those systems are necessarily inherently bad, they're just incomplete. And so this is where I'm interested in. I'm interested in filling in these gaps of understanding of power that's held in stories and mythologies and bits of pre-patriarchal history, and then also in experiential work that I've been doing over the last decade. And to that end, I am offering a select number of mentorships, but it's the opportunity to work with a few women who want to learn how to access and embody your full power using these more feminine methods that I've learned from my 10 plus years of research, plus all kinds of experiential work. It is kind of intense work, so it might not be for everybody, but if this sparks any kind of interest in you, then please do reach out. You can go on my website, book a discovery call, or you can send me an email. And if you've got questions or just want to chat, I'd love to hear from you. Okay, to shift our focus onto today's show. So one of the things that's been made really clear to me in my own research over the years is how much women's wisdom and power and our sacred practices and our experiences have been minimized, pushed underground, dismissed, written over, you name it. And I have to tell you that it used to be a source of endless rage for me. Sometimes it still is. But it's also sparked a lot of curiosity in me. So where are these nuggets of women's wisdom hiding? I'm just kind of referring to that with the work that I'm doing. But what if they're hiding in plain sight? What if they're encoded in places we might not even think to look or to take seriously? And I think my guest today, who has joined me here before, she's written a new book that I think does exactly this. It's a really beautiful job of unearthing women's power and wisdom that's hiding in all places in fairy tales. So let me go ahead and introduce her to you. Danielle Dulsky is the author of The Night House, Folklore, Fairy Tales, Rites, and Magic for the Wise and Wild, as well as numerous other titles, including Woman Most Wild, The Holy Wild Grimoire, and Bones and Honey. So if her name sounds familiar, she was here and talking about that book a couple years ago. A heathen visionary, painter, poet, storyteller, and word witch, she teaches internationally and has facilitated circles, embodiment trainings, communal spell work, and seasonal rituals since 2007. She's the founder of the Hag School and believes in the emerging power of wild collectives and sudden circles of curious dreamers, cunning witches, and rebellious artists in healing our ailing world. That sentence just gives me full body yes. She's joining us today from her home in New York State. Danielle, thanks so much for being back here. It's wonderful to see you again.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me back, Liz.
Yeah, and you are here to talk about a new book. This is exciting. First of all, I'm going to say it took me 6 years to write a book, so I'm quite impressed with how prolific you are. Channels of creativity are open, and I'm not envious. I am inspired. It's pretty great.
Thank you. Yeah, I do. Once I've got the title, it feels like a lot of it writes itself. Not all the time, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to, and those of you that have listened to the show, I usually start in the same place. I ask my guest about their background. I ask about their relationship with the feminine. Danielle has done all that in her prior episode, so I will put a link in the show notes if you want to listen to that episode. I highly recommend that you do. But since we've already done that, I would love to just, first of all, I want to tell you that I was really excited about the idea of this. I don't know if you're familiar with a fiction writer named Alex Harrow, who wrote the book The Once and Future Witches. She is one of my favorite fiction writers, and she sort of in that book, she is kind of planting the seed of fairy tales and nursery rhymes actually being the key to unlocking all of this women's wisdom and power. And that's a fiction book though, I mean, it definitely sparked a big aha in me. Oh, wow, wouldn't that be amazing? But I would just love to hear from you, I guess to start, just the impetus of this book. Like where'd you get the idea?
Yeah. Well, where did I get the idea? That's, I guess, is hard to name the book's origin story, but I've always loved fairy tales. And I think that in teaching a lot of word witchery, where I'm kind of trying to make it accessible, the understanding that there are these energetic currents in these old stories and that the medicine's going to always go where it needs to go, that there's a reason that they survived. It's really only in teaching where I can see a kind of validation that, like, oh, people are actually interested in this, and I'm not just a huge fairy tale nerd. And it's not that nobody cares. People do really want to know more about what I'm talking about. I did find, and I think that the reason it is because there is something in us, like you said, when we hear the phrase fairy tale or the term fairy tale, we take it less seriously
Yes.
on purpose. And that's the reason why these stories have survived, because, they were just children's stories. So having something in me that I think lives in all of us, where there's almost this paradoxical understanding that these stories are important, but also they're just children's stories. And me needing more so than with my other books, some kind of like external validation for the idea before I would write it. So with my other books on witchcraft, people that are into witchcraft, they take it very seriously, but fairy tales, not so much. So I think that while I can't really name the origin story or the idea for the book, I do have this series of memories where people were like, "Oh, yeah, let's learn more about that," or "Let's dig into that more." Yeah, it was only in the witnessing where the night house seemed like a good idea.
Yes. Yes. No, I love it, and I'm curious about. I wonder if you could talk to us too about the name of it. Yeah.
Yeah, the night house. I do always come up with the titles of my books first, like kind of before I even really know what the book's going to be about. So this is the sixth book, seventh if you count my oracle deck, and I've always just kind of had this title that pops into my head, and I'm like, all right, what can grow into this? So the night house, that stories are told in the dark. In Ireland, it's even bad luck to tell a story during the day. I think unless you're fishing, in which case it's okay. But it's considered bad luck to tell a story during the day. So thinking that good stories always kind of want the dark, and that there is something that's necessarily hidden about these stories. So, that there is, maybe you were speaking about power, if these old stories are these houses for power, and yes, feminine power in a lot of cases, I would even say most cases, then there's a reason they were tucked under the floorboards. They were transmitted primarily by women. They were collected by men, such as the Brothers Grimm, for example, but they were transmitted primarily by women. So, you know, in that way, they were kind of dismissed as like, the granny telling the grandchild in the rocking chair this story. And It's not going to be a threat to the powers that be because it's just a children's story. So, yeah, I just love this idea that there was a kind of strategy that wasn't necessarily conscious among the tellers, at least not all the time, but that maybe was very alive in the stories themselves. This kind of like, let's stay hidden. Sure, let's present ourselves as sugary, and I'm not necessarily bothered by Disney versions of the stories either, even though I know a lot of folklore scholars are a little bit have a kind of disdain for the more sugary coated tellings. But I feel like they're very necessary because there's a reason why they weren't hunted and outlawed. In some cases they were, but in most cases they survived because they were just kind of dismissed. So yeah, so that's why the Night House, they were kept hidden on purpose.
Yes. Well, yeah, I love that. And then the other thing that came to mind when I saw the title initially, and then just in journeying with some of the stories, is that there's a darkness here too. I mean, a lot of these stories, and I think people who are familiar with Clarissa Pinkola Estes too, with some of these stories, like there's some kind of dark, edgy material to them. And so I'm curious, your reflections, your thoughts on like kind of working that shadow material too, because it seemed like in reading them, and you know what, maybe even before we do that, why don't I back up for a minute and have you explain sort of how you laid the book out? Because it's really neat. You're not just retelling the stories, you're inviting people to have a full experience with the story itself, right? So I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, the book is structured like a house. So it's in three parts, and the first third of the book, which is called Hidden Rooms and Wild Skins, those are all stories about shape-shifting women where there's, a wild feathery pelt or a coat made of moss, or even the Red Hood from Little Red Riding Hood, which is maybe more familiar to people, where there is kind of this, magical object that allows you to become more true to who you are. And those stories, they're kind of seductive, and there's something that I think, especially when women hear those stories, they feel that their wilder and probably less palatable self is being seen. So that's sort of how you enter the Night House. And then there's the Bone Cellar, which is the middle part of the book, which, if I'm being honest, is the part that I was most excited to write because it is the gnarlier stories, and yet I knew I couldn't start with those.
I'm gonna tell you, Danielle, just in having interviewed you once before, that makes total sense to me. Why you'd be like, "Yeah, let's go there."
I mean, the stories that are in the Bone Cellar, if I would have, had all 13 be stories like that, but I also am very aware that not everybody opens a book and is ready to read about the cannibalistic hag or whatever. So those are in the middle, and those are the gnarlier stories. They don't necessarily all have gnarly endings, though a lot of them do, but they're mostly about death encounters. There's some shape shifting in there too, but it's sort of probably a sharper encounter with the shadow that is housed in all of these stories. I mean, even the more, lighthearted ones, I think, still have the shadow in there, which is part of the beauty of a fairy tale, is that the light just sits right alongside the dark. But the dark is a bit more amplified in the Bone Cellar, in the Night House. And then the last third of the book is the Spirit Tower, which is essentially where I let myself get as weird as I wanted to be. And those are mostly stories about dreams and time bending and time not moving the way that we normally would think that it's supposed to, linear time anyway. So yeah. So it's sort of like going in, shape shifting, wild skins, glamour objects. Then you go into the dark with the Bone Cellar, and then you go all the way up to the Spirit Tower where it's getting, just kind of like blowing apart our ideas around um, physics and the way the world works and what's rational and all of that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, and, I love the structure of the book, and then you also you're offering people ways to like directly relate the stories to their lives as well, which I also think is just really really interesting. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that part too.
Yeah, that was really what was most important to me in writing The Night House was to have a book where I can include the deeper work, which might be, altar building or spell crafting or a ritual or a rite that's kind of sourced from these old stories. But I also wanted to have something just like really simple and easy for the people that wouldn't be up for that. Not everybody's going to go build the altar to Sleeping Beauty. That's totally fine. So I think a simple practice that's repeated in every single chapter in The Night House, and it will work with any old story, whether it's a fairy tale or a myth, is once you read or listen to an old story for the first time, name your question that you have. Like once the story's over, once you hear the ever after, what do you wonder about the story? What feels like the missing piece or something a character did that frustrated you? And then you ask, why was that my question? Like you could have asked anything about this story and you ask that one question and it's always the very question of your life. So I have turned many people onto fairy tales that I would say are more story skeptics just by doing that because there's usually this like kind of oh shit moment and like yeah, okay, that's true. That is the very question of my life right now. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's what I was thinking too. And just also thinking about the name of the night house. And like a lot of times, well, and I want to hear if you agree with this, but like a lot of times that question is like really mining the shadows. Like it's not the stuff that's necessarily right. Like if it was on the surface, we'd probably very easily answer the question of our life. You know what I mean? Yeah, I'm just curious about, kind of intent or that invitation to get into these more shadowy places and how the fairy tales kind of help us do that.
Yeah, I think, and when you're working with that the question that remains practice, you can also take that one question that's about the story and then ask, okay, how is this a question about the world right now? So it doesn't have to be a life question. It can be a world question. It can be an ancestry or lineage question. Almost always inside that question, the more personal question, there is what I call the wish and the worry that's wrapped inside that one question. So, it's just a question like, will I ever find home or something like that? And you can see that there's this desire to find home in that question. And then there's this worry, what if I never find home? So the worry that's always in those questions usually does orient you towards something that is shadowy, something that is wanting to be integrated, not necessarily easily integrated, but at least it illuminates it and allows it to be witnessed, which is, I guess is the first step in shadow work.
Yes. Oh, I love that. I also, was just curious as I saw you talking about the book when it came out and there's always like a well, I think I'd have this question regardless of like why now? Like why do you think this particular material is really helpful for us at this moment in time when the world is ever increasingly a shit show to
Yeah. I mean, how strange it is the rhythm of like, writing a book and then you're kind of like removed from it for a little while as being edited and then you like come back. So, I've always felt that there is this like other level of hidden intelligence with my books where like I don't, the publication date isn't set by me. And yet they do always seem to come out in these very poignant times. My book, Seasons of Moon and Flame, which was my third book, came out in March of 2020. And the entire introduction, which of course I had written a whole year before that, is about like the apocalypse and like, community and coming together and what happens when the lights go out and all of that. And then
Yes.
it comes out in March of 2020. So Yeah, and then this book, The Night House, I had written that. Now time's kind of blurring for me, but I know for sure that it was totally written and set to come out way before the election. So, we were in this place of uncertainty, and yet there is a lot of talk about the naughty kings in the old stories, and how, this king, the king archetype is essentially like your inner ruler. So whether it's a king or a queen or a prince or a princess, it's all about the rules you set up for yourself and the boundaries that you create for yourself. And so when there is a sick and twisted king, for instance, in an old story, it tends to reflect back to you the rules that you've set up for yourself that need to die, or the boundaries that don't make sense anymore that need to be pushed. And then there's also this other layer where there's kind of like a plot for what to do when there's a naughty king, which is essentially like, don't buy into necessarily what the naughty king is telling you, and try to think as impossible as you can, and like get as weird as you can. Yeah. And then that's what I think we all need to be doing right now.
Yes. You're reminding me, I think you said this on the last podcast too, because I was like, "Yes, let's get weirder. How much weirder can" Loved that. I think yes, that really well, for sure. And I think there's something to me, there's something, and I'd love to hear you reflect on this too, but there's something about, like, weaving in women's wisdom that it does. I mean, even we know the origin of the word weird, right?
Fate.
Fate,
Yeah.
right. Yes, it's all about weaving and fate, and so if you think about, like, women's wisdom has been kinda pushed down or considered, like, not it's not that important, or, that's a it's a segmented interest even though we're talking about 50% of the population. Like, to bring that wisdom to the forefront and to respond to situations that even that we all know are outrageous and insane, but we're, like, working with a playbook that's, like, this big. To choose not to do that is probably gonna look weird, It's but look at what we consider normal in the first place, right?
Right. Right, and that's the thing is, the archetype means like high form or original form. So a king or a queen in an old story, they're sort of like this in many ways, not always, I guess, but in many ways, they're this pure embodiment of this ruler archetype. And what the ruler archetype never sits well with is the weird, because the weird is unpredictable. So, think about like, the king setting a set of laws, or, even ones that feel like they're draconian or don't make sense. And then the freaks that are like, well, we're obviously not going to do that. I mean, that's the worst thing for the king. So, yeah.
Well, and I feel like okay, so this is kind of veering me into a space of just wanting to talk to you a little bit about the idea of magic, and I just magic in general. And so I think there's this well, first of all, and I write this in my book, there's this simultaneously dismissing magic is not real and yet total cultural obsession with it. Like, I mean, there's so many all of our obsession with superheroes. These are magical beings, or like the mythical creatures, the children. If you were listening to this for any reason, turn this podcast off. But the mythical beings that are sneaking into our homes and dropping off gifts and taking teeth from under pillows and things. We are bending over backwards to convince our children that this stuff is real, and yet
Yeah.
there's that simultaneous, like, rejection of it, and I know that this is a huge part of your world, and so I'm just curious how you understand that paradox.
Yeah. Wow. I feel like I could go in any number of directions with this, because you're right. There is, I think, an ancient impulse in everyone to validate the other world. And, I always think about this one friend that I have that I would call like my most skeptical friend. And even he has this story from when he was young, and he had a close friend die, and that close friend like showed up at the moment of death, like in his room. And yet, he's the one that's like, well, ghosts aren't real and witches are stupid. It's all of that. And I'm always like, well, what about that one thing? And he was like, well, yeah, that was real. So, it's almost like there's this necessary compartmentalization of the magic among some people where, it does exist. They kind of allow it this safe place to have happened in their story where they honor it, and yet they maybe out of some version of self-protection have to completely invalidate it in the rest of the world. But even then there's still this place where they're like, well, yeah, and they kind of like protect that story or that place, like the ghost story or the dream that came true or whatever. And I wonder, and I don't know for sure, but I do wonder if that's not all that different from fairy tales being consistently and historically dismissed over time, and then that is allowing them to survive in the way that they need to, and not just survive but move. The old stories really want to move, they want to travel. So, being able to kind of fly under the radar, so to speak, because there aren't that many people that are going to like, stop and amplify them in these huge, wild ways, that's kind of what they need in order to keep going. Because maybe the world's not ready for the magic to wake up and be visible by everyone. Yeah.
Yeah, well, what's interesting when you were talking too is I was also thinking about my kids who probably with most kids, went through a massive Harry Potter obsession phase, and the magic in those books, and it's very literal, and it's very like big and it's in your face, and like the superhero stories too, like fine if people don't think that's definitely magic to me. Like if you can fly, like that's magic. That's very like huge and out there and in your face too. And that there's something to me about like in the fairy tales, there's a subtlety to it, right? And I that's my understanding of some of this work, when we think about magic, and also I'm kind of wrapping in the idea of women's kind of women's secrets, women's wisdom, that it's more subtle, which is I don't know. Do you agree with that?
I think I know what you mean. Story, whether it's a chapter you're reading in a book or it's the superhero movie, it's providing this container, this pretty closed container, because, when you're watching that movie or your kids are watching that movie or you're reading that chapter, you're living in that story between the once upon a time and the ever after. And so you're in this place, especially I guess if it's a fairy tale or a superhero movie, where you're just willing to accept as true whatever's going to be presented to you, right? And so I wonder if the fairy tales, they do have the subtle magic in there. I think that at least with the ones that I'm interested in, there's usually like one thing that is not subtle among the rest of the more subtle magic. So, if I'm thinking of like a superhero movie where like everybody's flying or able to bend time or whatever, and like it's just like this magical overload. But then there's a fairy tale where, everything's normal, the witch in the woods that has the burning skull that's going to, be able to ignite your intuition forever, but the rest of it is follows the laws of physics and operates as we would expect. But here's this one thing, and that allows whatever that one thing is to be amplified in a way that maybe we don't get with the big blockbuster Hollywood movies, maybe.
I love that. Well, and I guess I think what I now as I was looking back to what I said, I was also kind of weaving two things together there that maybe aren't the same. I love what you're saying, and I'm also thinking too about the very like having conversations with my kids, or and them to be like, it's not real. You can't. I can't pick up this wand, that I got at Universal Studios. It only works at that like at that one display in Florida when you point the wand just right, like, it doesn't work. It's not real, and so there's something to me too about, like, if, like the negative, the wisdom or the magic is kind of hiding. It's hiding somewhere where, like, of course, it's not going to be that blatant. Somebody would have pointed their wand at our current president a long time ago, if that works.
Like my kids are they're 16 and 19 now. And I would say that my older son, my 19-year-old, he's been skeptical his entire life. So like, they grew up with me as their mom and, hearing me talk about all the things that I talk about, like, hosting coven circles in their house. Like that's how they grew up. And it's also this kind of dismissal of like, oh yeah, but my mom's a witch. Like just not naming it as important and also I think pretty dismissive about it, maybe necessarily so in a lot of cases. But with my older son, there's this coming back around now that I kind of didn't see coming, where he's he's asking about things that he having a bad dream when he was a kid, and was there this ghost in his room when we lived in this one house, and like I knew that there was. And so this kind of revisiting of what was presented to him as magic when he was growing up, and then he kind of went through this his own self dismissal of that as socialization and wanting to fit in with friends, I guess. And now there's this kind of like, oh, it's safe to come back to this now and questioning, was it real or was it not real? So yeah. Anyway, I kind of lost my train of thought a
No,
little
it's
bit.
okay. So we're just sort of riffing here, and I'm kind of wanting to keep going with the question of magic, just because I know not just at this book, but all of your body of work, and I'm just curious what you think is possible using the realm of what we would call magic. When we look around at the and that might even be a two-part question, like what's possible in the realm of our lives, and then what's possible in this broader cultural structure that we're all participating in, like there's a I think maybe this is like a practical application question of like, what can we do? What can we actually do when we turn towards this realm of magic, whether that's through fairy tales or otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, that's it. That's the question. I think that a big part of my witchcraft has always been and continues to be looking at my magic as a conversation with the world about the kind of world I want the children of the future to live in, like 900 years from now, not my grandkids, but like way far out. What do I want that world to be? Knowing that even if I cast a small spell for myself, like, like calling in a certain amount of money or something like that, that too is a kind of container for the same values that if I would cast a spell for my people or local community or global community, that it would be these ripples that are sharing the same threads of value, or what I would call like the truest currencies. That is, if I always ask my people this question, like, if you were going to die a year from now and the powers that be were like, you get to seed the next civilization of humanity, like what would you want to put in that constitution, or what would be the gift for this new community that's going to be born after you're gone? And whatever you would name there, and usually it's not that many things, usually it's like three, four, at most five of these core values. And if you look at the small spells that you would cast for you or for the world, they're going to have those same things in them. So to answer your question about what's possible, I think technically anything's possible. However, I think that we are all here individually to do pretty much like one specific thing. Like, I think that one of the, and something that I've told my kids over and over again, and goes against what I think a lot of society tells them, is that they can't grow up and be anything they want to be. like you are here. I don't know what it is you're going to be, but you are here to be one thing. And life is sort of moving toward whatever that thing is. Purpose means the object to be kept in view. So it takes a certain amount of decades to figure out what that object is that's yours that you're moving toward, that North Star, but that's your thing. So while anything is broadly possible, I think that your magic is better served if it's always oriented toward that particular purpose that does stay hidden and in the dark. I think until, I mean, at least your late 20s, early 30s, that Saturn return time. After that, I think it gets a little bit clearer. But yeah, we're here to do like, a pretty singular thing, which is liberating. And I know that a lot of people find that limiting, but I think it's incredibly exciting as an Aquarian.
That's perfect. Well, and okay, I'm just gonna name a little magic here because I had marked one passage in your book that I was like, this is is so just on the nose, and it's so funny that that's what you were speaking to. I'll just read a little bit of it here where you said, "Part of our work in these troubled times, if not our only work, is to tend our unique purpose." This means that no matter the horror, no matter the news stories of ecocide and genocide, no matter the grip of politicians' hands on our bodily autonomy, no matter the brutality of war, we are tasked with tending to our purpose as much as we are able. And I just, so that was kind of perfect that you're speaking to that. I love that so much. Yes. How would you describe yours? What's your one thing? Which one is spot?
I mean, it seems to have something to do with embodiment and storytelling because I've always had this, I used to teach yoga. I'm very into dance and movement and the way movement kind of syncs up with clairvoyance and psychic work and healing and then these stories. So, yeah, I know that I'm naming more than one thing, but I do feel like I can create one word that means all of that.
Sure. Well, and I am also wanting to riff a little bit on the idea of storytelling. It's interesting to me because we do have tons of stories in our culture, like through our entertainment. We have a lot of stories that we are exposing ourselves to. And yet, like the concept of storytelling as a way to construct the world that you want to see, or that actually this is how we are making meaning from what we're looking at, I don't feel like that's a super common connection that people make. I don't know if you feel that way too, but I feel like a lot of times the entertainment is the entertainment. We're not actually thinking about it as storytelling, but that's exactly
Yeah.
what's happening, right? Like when we go to the movies or we watch television shows or whatever it is, like we're engaging with a worldview that tells us this is the way that the world is.
Right.
And we're kind of buying into it in a way, right?
Right. And, that's the kind of like good news, bad news thing, or and also the magical part of storytelling is like, you know, these these stories, if we're talking fairy tales and not literary fairy tales that were written, but these collected fairy tales that were primarily orally transmitted. If they're in like, the Grimm brothers book or whatever, they're super short. They're like, for the most part, they're a few paragraphs. And so if I go to tell this story on the page, if I were to just read this page, it would take me 5 minutes. But I know that it's going to take me, an hour to tell this story in the way that I want to tell it. And so when I'm in that place of speaking this story where, yes, I know basically how the plot is going to go, or Dr. Estes would call that the bones of the story that sing flesh onto or how flesh onto these bones. But the storyteller's always surprised by how that goes. Like, we know the plot, but the rest of what comes out when you're speaking that story, that is really this incredible magic that I think is co-created between the teller and the people who are listening. And so there is this, like, to go back to what you were saying, there is this kind of ache around having to make certain very magical stories palatable so people listen to them and pay attention to them, and they're just like ew and they close the book. But in doing that, you're allowing that story to meet the world in a way that it wouldn't otherwise. And so there is this kind of dance that the storyteller does where, you've got the fidelity to the skeleton of the story's plot where you know how that's going to go, but the rest of it is just kind of this magical, spontaneous encounter that is different every single time you tell the story, even if you've told it 10,000 times. And you really only get proof that that's true after you've told the same story, you know, I'm going to say at least a dozen times, if not more. Then you have this like, oh, I told it different again. Who saw that coming? And it's always really right, and there's always that's the way where you get your proof, whether you're telling the story or listening to the story, you get your proof that a story is an oracle. So, going back to that, like, asking that one question that remains, the story's always gonna show you exactly what you need to know at that time, just like when you pull a tarot card and you're gonna interpret it in a certain way, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I was thinking as you were talking. I was like, "Oh, it's like working with, tarot or oracle."
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I think kind of in keeping in that space, I'm curious if in this moment right now while we're talking, if there's any of those particular stories that you share that are really resonant with you. Like I'm imagine some, are consistently resonant, some feel more resonant at times than others, but if there's any of those that really speak to you.
Yeah. It's it's a good question. I think that it changes for me these days almost every day, and I know that that's not always true. Like, I do have chapters in my life where, there's this one story that's just so alive in my psyche, and I'm dreaming about it, and I'm writing about it, and poetry about this one story, and it goes on for many months sometimes. But, right now, and maybe this is just kind of the vibe of autumn, but, I'm in this place where also maybe it's the vibe of menopause. But I just wake up a completely different person, and not just a different person, but with different hopes for what the world is going to be 900 years from now. Like, that stays pretty consistent, but what I get to see in my lifetime, I feel, is changing rapidly as far as what I hope that is. Some days I wake up and I'm like, I'm gonna see aliens this year. Some days I wake up and I'm like, I just hope that we make it to the end of the year.
Yes.
Yeah. So anyway, so to go back to your question, right now there's a story in the book called The Mage's Bird. The original title for that is Spitcher's Bird. It's sort of the German version of Bluebeard. And in this book, the idea is, or the main theme is like, don't get blood on the egg. So, she's the warrior bird woman in this story is needing to essentially defeat this shadow man character who's kidnapping and murdering women. And she does that by not by protecting this egg, which is essentially a symbol of her art or creative innocence or power. And she is incredibly creative in this story. And she goes to this dark place, this bloody well, this bloody room, and she leaves the egg tucked away in the kitchen so that she doesn't get blood on this egg. And I feel like that's the metaphor for these times. If there's like one guiding image in an old story for me that's going to carry me through at least the next few years, it's that. It's like, I can't let myself get too down about the state of the world to the point where I don't write or I don't create, because if I do that, then they win. Then the shadow man wins, right? And so, that like, tuck the egg away, go do the gnarly shit that you need to do, but protect that creative potential that you were born with, no matter what. Because I think we're in a time where it's never going to seem like the perfect moment to put your book out, or the perfect moment to like finally do that thing, because we're in it, and I think we're going to be in it, and we can't let it stop us from creating.
Yes. Oh, I love that so much. And then who's to say that the creation itself or the whatever the egg is that we're protecting is not also part of the different story that is being woven that we can't or written
Right.
can't even see yet. I'm just thinking of the energy of creation versus reaction. And there's a time and a place for both, right? Or there's value in all all things, but yeah, there's a lot of reason to be reactive these days, but, like, reactive energy also feels kind of constricted to me, like, there's a tightness and I don't know what's coming, so I'm gonna smack back, as opposed to creative energy is more expansive, and I just can't imagine the constrictive energy getting us out of where we're at right now, like,
Right.
that doesn't
Exactly.
that doesn't
We're going to have to get weirder.
This is so perfect. I just feel like you just wrapped it right back around to the last time we talked. We are absolutely gonna have to get weirder, and I feel like this is a perfect unless you have anything you wanna add to that about, like, how weird you're getting right now to
No,
inspire
I don't think we need to go there.
but we do, Danielle, that's the whole point. We
Yeah, I mean, I am. Yeah. So, going back, I am prefacing this by saying that I am an Aquarian. So I am very interested in the cosmic, the celestial. And I do kind of feel like, I've never been a conspiracy theorist, but I do feel like there's things going on that we aren't being told that are um, cosmic in nature. And I think that the rise of artificial intelligence, that like we're about to see some crazy shit. And, if we don't get it, it's only the weird people that are going to be here for it because because it's going to be so strange that I think having our hard-edged understandings about like the way the world works, that we're just really about to get that blown apart over the next 10 years. And to stay malleable, we have to be in that place that we were when we were children, like you were saying. Like, what if the tooth fairy does come and take my tooth from under my pillow? Or what if Santa is real? Like, there's a part of us that still has it and protects that old place, that ancient place of like acknowledging that the other world has currents in it that enter into our heavy material world and shape it in all of these different ways. And I think that we all understand that, even if we would vocalize that that's not true. There's something in us that understands that. And that's the thing that's the place that we're going to need to lean into as the world continues to get stranger and stranger.
I love it, love it. There's your takeaway. Get yourself into the night house and start getting really, really, really weird. Danielle, thank you so much for being here. I'm gonna hold the book up for my viewers. The Night House, check it out. It's pretty rich. I mean, just all the rites and things that you put in it. There's a lot of depth. I mean, if you can just also read the stories if that's for you, but there's a lot of work that you can do with it. And I will put that in the show notes for sure. Thank you so much for being here. This is such a pleasure as always.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and come back anytime you want to, riff on how weird we can get. We could just pour an episode around that.
Yay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to all of you for listening. As always, it's such a joy to share this with you. Reach out on social media if you've got thoughts, feedback, comments, suggestions. If you like the show, you can subscribe. Please leave it a favorable review. It takes nothing if you're listening on Apple Podcasts to, hit a 5 stars there. And yeah, if you think somebody else could benefit from hearing this, please do pass this episode along.